Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whatever time you are tuning in. Welcome to Homesteading and Gardening in the Suburbs. I'm Emma from Misfit Gardening, and today we're talking all about winter sowing because winter is definitely here. The holidays are almost upon us. Summer most definitely is over. As I look outside, I see snow on the mountains, snow in the garden, and just because it's snowing doesn't mean that our gardening season has really come to an end, and that's what I want to talk about today. And this comes at a perfect time because the winter solstice is just around the corner, and usually after the winter solstice occurs, that's when daylight hours start to get longer. So for those of you that don't know, the winter solstice is on or around December the 21st of the calendar year. You can do a quick internet search and see when it is for your area. For me, it is on Sunday the 21st of December, and because of that, I am super stoked to start doing some winter sowing. But let's talk about what is winter sowing first of all. Well, winter sowing is basically where you start seeds inside a small container outside in the middle of winter, right? And it sounds a little crazy because a lot of people, when they're growing or starting to grow plants in winter, a lot of people are doing it inside. I'm no different. I have my own setup with seed starter, flats and grow lights and all that fun stuff. But there's actually plenty that can be sown outside, and a lot of seeds actually benefit from being put in that cold winter conditions, because it's exactly how nature works. So and we'll talk a little bit about what seeds work well with this method in a minute or two. But first, let's talk about some tools or equipment that you're going to need to do some successful winter sowing. And the first is the ever popular milk jug or milk carton, and we're talking about the semi-clear translucent plastic ones that you can get, not necessarily the cardboard ones. But you want something that's pretty rigid, that you can easily move around and put a few seeds in to start with. You want something that's going to be able to hold some potting soil, something that you can put some holes in to allow for drainage of water, because we still need to have good drainage, and something that's easy to label, and something that will, be able to cover that soil and those seeds as they grow. So a milk jug's become pretty much the standard for winter sowing, but it doesn't mean that it's the only thing. You could use some empty fizzy pop bottles or soda bottles. You can use those plastic tubs from, bagged salad stuff. There's, the limit's really your imagination in what you can use. But a milk jug is pretty much the poster child for winter sowing. But why would we want to do some winter sowing? And there's a couple of advantages. The first thing really is that they don't take up space inside your home, and when you're already trying to figure out, how to get your peppers and tomatoes and all those warm weather things started. The great advantage of doing some winter sowing where you can do it straight outside. You don't necessarily need a greenhouse or anything like that to be able to handle seed starting. You can just do it all outside. That's really quite advantageous. But some other benefits to doing it is that, there's actually a lower risk of seeds damping off, which is a fungus problem that can happen with indoor seeds that are starting. They're already growing outside. You don't need to harden them off. They don't need to acclimate to the temperatures and the climate, because it's already happening as they're growing. They are going to sprout when they are ready, and it means that the seedlings that you're producing are a lot more hardy. They're a lot more robust, and people say that they've got a much higher survival rate from doing this seed starting method, and it means you can plant your seeds much earlier. But a minute of caution, or that I've got to say is, there is no point in you trying to do this with warm weather crops. So don't bother with tomatoes, peppers, squash, anything like that. Stick with the cool weather crops, and we're going to talk about what some of those are in a minute or two. Let's talk a little bit about the soil that you need to use, and I've found that really just a all-purpose, organic, OMRI-listed potting soil works just fine, and maybe I'll add in a little bit of worm castings or something like that. But you want to make sure that you're using like a potting soil or a seed starting soil. Don't use soil out of the garden, because it's just going to be full of weed seeds, and you're going to end up growing those. It's also heavy, and it may not drain as well, so use a good quality potting soil to get yourself off to the best start with this. So to get started, what we want to do is we want to take that transparent or translucent plastic container that you've got, and we want to be able to hold a good 3 or 4 inches of soil in the bottom, right? And it needs to have enough space so seedlings and things can grow up there, and they're not going to hit the top of the container. So what we want to do is we want to get a container, and if we're doing a milk jug, we want to kind of cut it in half and cut it straight across, being very careful with whatever cutting implement that you're using, right below the bottom of that handle, to give your seeds plenty of space in that growing medium that we're going to be putting in there. So you want to cut it off. You want to put some holes in the bottom. Some people cut it off entirely and then retape the actual container with some duct tape or something to make kind of like a hinged lid. Or you can cut 3/4 of the way round, so you've still got kind of a hinge with that plastic on there. Make sure you put plenty of drainage holes in there, because we don't want things getting waterlogged. That is still, something that we need to be mindful of. So we put in our growing potting soil in there, and I like to get everything wet in that container and give it a good water before I put the seeds in, because sometimes when you've got a potting soil, especially if you've bought it out of a big box store, it can be really, really dry and take quite some time for that water to absorb. So I like to pre-wet everything before I start sowing, and sometimes it can take an hour or two for everything to be thoroughly moist through. Sometimes it can be a day. If you've got the coconut coir stuff, it can take a little bit longer. So just make sure that the soil that you're putting into your container is definitely moist all the way through. Now the bit that you've really been waiting for: what can you actually sow using this method? Well, it's quite a list, guys. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this list in a free downloadable as well, to save you trying to remember all this while you're driving or writing it all down. So I'm going to put the link to that in the description of this podcast episode, so you can get a hold of that. So let's get going. So you can do onions or part of the allium families, so that's chives, garlic, shallots, onions, especially if you're doing them from seed, okay? I wouldn't recommend trying to do onion or shallot sets, and I definitely wouldn't recommend sowing garlic cloves using this method. I would put those straight out into the garden if your soil is still workable. Beets are really good, so beetroot, also members of the brassica or cabbage family, so cabbages, broccoli, kale, collards, Brussels sprouts, all that good stuff. Those work exceptionally well with this method of sowing. Celeriac or celery root and celery also have done quite well, and same with Swiss chard. If you've got leafy lettuces like winter density lettuce, or some of those that are a bit more cool weather tolerant like mash or corn salad, those kind of things, those do really well with this type of winter sowing. Also spinach, they do really well. parsnips, peas. Peas definitely like the cooler weather. Radishes as well seem to do quite well with this method of gardening. I've also tried doing rutabagas and turnips, and they seem to also do well, but again, they're all part of the brassica family as well. Some herbs do quite well with this method as well. So things like sage and thyme, they do quite well, and then some of those herbs that tend to self-seed and can kind of go a little bit rampant, like borage, anise, chives do well, cilantro or coriander, dill, kind of fennel, those herbs also do well with this type of sowing. And a lot of the reason that these plants do so well with this method is because it's mimicking that natural way that they grow. So if you think about plants in the summertime, you know, they will flower and they produce seeds, and then those seeds are dispersed and, you know, fallen onto the ground, and then winter happens. So they're normally subjected to these really cold temperatures, and then in the spring when things warm up again and the daylight gets longer, they will germinate, right? That's kind of what happens normally. And because of that, there's flowers and perennials that also grow really well using this method. So we've got plants like bee balm, also butterfly weed. So the butterfly weed especially does well after a cold snap. Some of my favourites from England are carnations and Canterbury bells, also chrysanthemums, clematis, daylilies, delphiniums, evening primrose, flax. Oh, I love flax, is really pretty. Foxglove, that's poisonous, but it does grow really well. Same with hollyhocks. I've winter sown a bunch of hollyhock seeds by just scattering them about in the garden, so they'll come up the next year. Also iris, lamb's ear, lupin, meadowsweet. There's so many different plants that you can start sowing using this method. And, you know, one of the great things that we talked about a little bit earlier in this episode was, you know, you can sow so many more things because you're not having to take up all the space in your home doing this method. So if you drink a lot of milk, unfortunately we don't in my family because I'm lactose intolerant, so the only milk that I seem to get is in cartons. But when my family decide that they want normal milk, we like to save the jugs to be able to do this method of sowing. And predominantly we've used it to sow flowers for the garden. And, you know, in the last year or two, we've done a lot more winter sowing without really the jug containers particularly, but using that same method for the sowing trays, for the seed starting trays, and popping them into the greenhouse. But some tips that you've got to bear in mind if you're using this method and you're using the jug, the milk carton containers to do this. And that is, after you have sown your seeds into that soil, you want to make sure that you tape up that enclosure to make a nice seal around it to help keep those little seedlings and the seeds themselves protected from that super cold weather. And a lot of people just use duct tape to tape up that cut that they've done. You can also write on the duct tape so you remember what on earth it was that you sewed in there, because if you look at a bunch of brassicas, for example, that have all come up, the seedlings all look the same, so it's really hard to tell what it was that you planted there. But some top tips when you're doing this method is, number one, don't sow loads of seeds in that little space. Put a few in there, probably no more, definitely no more than 10. I tend to put maybe 5 seeds in there, just so things have got plenty of space to actually come up and grow, and they're going to be in there a while, so you need to allow for space for your plants to grow. Okay, you want to give them plenty of airflow in there because they're not going to be moving much, right? The second tip is you're going to want to make sure you check on them periodically and make sure that you give them a bit of water if everything's looking dry. And the great thing if you're using the milk jug is if you leave the cap off, you can just kind of look in there and see if it looks dry, and then you can add a little bit of water in there as you're checking them. And you don't want your seeds to dry out, particularly. They do still need water. And if you've got things that have sprouted in there, you definitely want to make sure that you're giving them some water. Otherwise, they're just going to dehydrate and die. The next tip is you don't want to put these somewhere where they're going to get full sun, okay? You want to let them have a bit of sun, probably either in the mornings, so maybe on an eastern aspect of your property, or maybe a little in the afternoon, but you definitely want to avoid some of that, full midday sun, because they're in a little baby greenhouse essentially, and what's going to happen is, as the heat of the day is getting in there from the sunlight, the temperatures can ramp up a lot, and you can essentially steam bake your seedlings in there and it will just fry them. So we don't want to do that, because then you won't have anything germinate, because you're basically solarizing that soil that's in there, and it's going to kill off all the weeds. Great if you're trying to kill off your weeds, but not so great if you're trying to sow things to grow for next year. So keep it somewhere where you're only going to get some easterly or westerly sunlight. Try and avoid somewhere where it's going to be in it all day. So for me, I wouldn't put it on the south side of my property. I would probably put it more towards the west side, because that's where I've got my greenhouse and things are a little bit easier to take care of there. So that's some tips for using this method. The next thing to talk about is when to really stop sowing using this method. And I mean, you can keep sowing this way all the way up to, spring is arriving. When you get to a point where you're thinking that you don't need a coat, hat and gloves when you're outside anymore, you probably want to stop sowing using this method, and you want to maybe concentrate on direct sowing into your garden beds instead. But one of the wonderful things about using this winter sowing method is that all those lovely containers that you've got ready to go, once your seedlings have really established themselves in there, when it gets to being closer to spring, you can be transplanting those seedlings into your garden beds under some light frost protections, maybe some frost fleece or a little hoop house there. And by using that method, especially using the frost protection too, you can end up having harvests up to 6 weeks earlier than somebody else growing in your area. So it's a really novel way to be growing, especially at this time of year when there's not a lot to look at other than snow, some more snow, maybe a light drizzle, some ice perhaps, but then some more snow. But I would really like to hear from you guys if you have tried this method of sowing before and whether it worked for you, or even if it didn't work for you. I would love to know more. So if you're tuning into this on YouTube, let me know in the comments, or reach out on wherever you're listening to this from your podcast. Until next time, I hope you have a wonderful week and a very happy holidays.